What I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about the sort of things that we all do. And unfortunately, please don't ask what that is. Because one of the problems is if you dedicate your life, as I have, to not having a career, this is sort of where you end up. And it's sort of okay until someone asks what you do, or until you have to fill out the line that's about an inch long on the passport. Or, you know, there are any number of these moments where it's inconvenient. We're sort of at the collision between art and technology, for lack of another point. If you had art and technology heading down the road at 90 miles per hour each, and they collided, that's what we do. We're not really scientists, and we're not really artists, and we're not really poets. You end up where I am when basically you believe deep down inside in your heart that ideas and story is what really matters above all other things in design, and heart is what matters. But you love toys. It's a real problem. And, you know, in my company, there are more computers than there are people. We may even figure out how to use some of them one of these days. Generally speaking, the newer the technology is, the gap between when it arrives and when it's obsolete narrows, to the extent that we now get obsolete equipment unopened in the box. However, all said, it's still significantly better than working for a living. And I think that basically what we've tried to do is avoid being categorized. Now, this is difficult when someone has to put you in a smart yellow pages, for example. That was $3. Especially because we sort of take projects based upon the fact that we are not really competent to do them, meaning we've never done them before. Our general definition of the right kind of job is something that hopefully no one's done before, but certainly we haven't done before. And just as we become expert in something, we tend to move on to things that we're less expert in, just to sort of keep the edge. Unfortunately, in the entertainment industry, rather than the leading edge, we tend to work at the trailing edge. And one of our problems is that technology and invention, especially invention, in our case, is really an artifact of the design process. We don't wake up intending to invent something, but we usually end up inventing things because after designing some splendid moment, you then pick up the phone and call for splendid moment number 39 vendors, and you find that, unfortunately, the technology tends to be driven by people who have applications rather than people like ourselves who want to do one thing, not repeat it again. Our clients generally come to us saying, we want something completely unique, special, that's never been seen before. And by the way, would you mind showing us 3 examples of it so we can be sure it'll work? I also get more and more nervous that fundamentally I'm a member of a digital society in an analog world. You know, it's, you look out there and the trees and air and earth and, you know, all of those other things doesn't seem to have an awful lot to do with numbers. And what we're doing, I think, is trying to keep technology as transparent as possible. But just as with a painter, it's useful that the paint doesn't fall off the canvas 6 months after you've painted it. It is useful in doing what we do to understand the nuts and the bolts and the wires and the code and so forth. However, I don't know how many of you didn't go through the experience, but I went through the experience starting at school, which I despised more than any other experience except one, that I've ever, that's right, that would be telling. But going through this, one was finally placed in a room with a computer. And you knew that this was going to be the solution to all of your problems. I have yet, actually, to experience that moment. Part of our job is beating technology into submission. We are constantly trying to make things that don't really work. As a result, I think that while other people were busy initially inventing concepts like virtual memory and then virtual reality and all sorts of other things, we're sort of inventing virtual clients. And sort of virtual technology, virtual art, virtual employees. What we are constantly pushed to do is come up with things that don't have to be real, they just have to appear to be real. That's what special effects is about. You have to persuade people that they have experienced, witnessed, or taken part in something, even though it may not have happened. And we're now trying to extend this into many other fields. Why? Because people call us up on the phone and say, would you mind extending this into our field? We're constantly alarmed and upset that if you dedicate yourself to obscure development of interesting ideas, little machines, moments, explosions, nuclear devices, whatever other sorts of things you like to work on, and you do it with absolutely no intent that this is a career or profession, and then all of a sudden the phone starts ringing. And I think that's what I find astonishing about TED, is that technology, entertainment, or education and design is the stuff that we've been doing for 15 or 20 years. And basically, we cared a lot about it, but no one really thought it was a business or something that people would actively be interested in. And much to my surprise, look at all these people here, that people actually are interested in this stuff. And this means it's time to get into some other line of work, I think. When I'm dealing with creating images for people, the premise of film, which on one level is lots of little pictures lined up that you can grab onto with your hand, which is kind of nice, but more to the point, when I'm sitting in my editing room, which has sort of a smelly couch and remnants of sandwich and beer and other things like that scattered around it, and I'm looking for a clip, and the assistant is trying to find this clip, there's 10 or 15 minutes which allows me to do something called think. And I find this very valuable. When I'm in an electronic editing situation, there are people getting paid more than I am saying, well, and you're... And somehow or other you lose that moment to think, especially because you realize that it just cost a Yugo to pause and reflect upon whether this is a good idea. And so I think that's what I'm always wrestling with, is that very often the improvement of the technology has to be, again, guided and directed in such a way that it is in fact useful for what you're trying to do in design. Frankly, not an awful lot of this room have ever watched a spaceship explode in front of a planet with any number of Klingon vessels surrounding it. And therefore, if you do something that just sort of looks okay, and you make the right sound bang for outer space. This is very important, getting the proper galactic resonance to space sounds. People will pretty much buy it. On the other hand, if you have to do a storm, well, people see storms. They look out, they see clouds, they see lightning. And I'm getting more and more to really enjoy doing the sort of effects work which has absolutely nothing to do with special effects in the conventional sense, but where you go through a whole process and you've basically completely conned the audience. They think it really happened. They don't see the effects. They don't see what's happening. Unfortunately, this doesn't get you a lot of work because basically they go to the film and where were the effects and gee. Anyway, so you do need to pay some attention to making the effects visible. Our work is now expanding out into areas such as architecture and design of spaces. This is very exciting for us. At first, people said, well, come work on this project, which is a sophisticated combination of design and visuals and entertainment and retailing. And I said, retailing? Now, wait a minute. This sounds like a mall. And this was an interesting moment in my life. There's a moment you wake up and, it occurs to you that you're working for the US government, or it occurs to you that you're working for that person that as you were growing up, you swore you'd never work for. The idea of working on a mall, I couldn't say the word for about 3 weeks. And this is difficult when you're in meetings with the people who are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to do these things. But I've come around to feeling that actually this stuff is very important. And it's very important because while you can have in your lab or on a project or on a show on Broadway or on a rock show a couple of magical moments which might touch someone, and to me it's interesting the difference between film and theater because their strength is their weakness. Film is permanent, theater isn't. That's what's good and what's bad about both of them. In theater, you can witness something with a brilliant performance and a brilliant actor, and you know that will never happen again in history. And that's quite special, to witness that and be a part of it. At the same time, it'll never happen again in history, and therefore, when you're trying to tell your friend about it, you have only the memory, and maybe that's good enough. Film is permanent, and unfortunately this means when you do it badly, you have to look at it for a long time. And the phone rings and says, gee, did you work on that? Yeah. But anyway, we can always blame someone else. That's the nice thing about being in the effects business. Nothing has to do with individuals. It's teams of very gifted, talented, and often annoying people who come together and execute a project. But if you do it badly, you can always say it was his fault, and they made me do it. I think that what's interesting to me about the idea of moving effects and moving visuals and moving design into architecture and into the environment and into people's homes through interactive media, through any number of other things, is that one has the ability to hopefully positively affect, if not just leave it at affect, the environment of people's everyday lives and perhaps introduce them to experiences that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. And I find that's very exciting and very challenging. And what we're trying to do now is create new visual concepts and experiences that are less like a ride at Disneyland. And incidentally, I love rides at Disneyland. And more like the Pantheon. Something where you walk into it and it takes your breath away and you're not even sure why. And what we're trying to do now is sort of synthesize that and bring technology into it. We're creating programmable buildings, buildings which you walk into it and the corridor ends up in a different place each day. There are reasons why this could be considered desirable, which I won't get into, but trust me, there are actually reasons for this. In one of these buildings that we're doing, the entire outside of the building is liquid crystal. And when I say the entire outside, I mean the entire outside. And the building changes form and shape and look dynamically, so that when you go there in the morning, it's different than it is in the afternoon, which is different than it is in the evening. And in fact, the entire outsides of the building at night are projection surfaces, and so it can be covered with ivy or moss or stars or planets, or it can look like the building across the street, which is very confusing. And God forbid if both buildings were like, anyway. One of the things which I enjoy about liquid crystal technology was at one point on a long conversation with the person who makes liquid crystals, the subject of toxicity came up because, you know, basically if we build a building and someone swallows it and they die, I lose my kitchen. And it was pointed out to me that liquid crystal is made from either sheep or goat hair. It's like lanolin and these cholesteric esters and so on and so forth, and people here actually know more about it than I do. But the idea that you're shaving goats, grinding it up, running it through a factory, and putting it on the surface of the highest technology exterior is somewhat appealing to me on a level that I don't really understand. And I think we need more goat hair in technology, actually. Other areas that we're working on include personal simulators. I figure if people can have personal computers and all of that stuff, we can have personal simulators. And the idea of something that does what an F-18 simulator does, or does what an entertainment attraction ride simulator does, but does it to an individual under the individual's control, is something we're very interested in. And not so much that this is astounding new technology, but the question is, how do you make it cheap? How do, instead of spending $40 million, you do it for $40,000? And we've got a fairly extensive effort going on in that, where we're taking miniature motion bases and gimbal platforms with stereo input to the eyes and a lot of fairly sophisticated sensory stuff going on to create not just an environment around you, but to create the ability to turn you upside down in that environment. And I think that's fun. I mean, I think fun is important to this, and the idea of creating a simulator which lets you go for a ride in a jet airplane or lets you take a walk on the planet. The idea is, and there's some people here doing extraordinary things in that, incidentally, which I think are just wonderful. But what we're working on is the motion control technology to do it. Spin-off of entertainment motion control technology, which is something we've been doing for years, making cameras run by computers and making robotic characters and other things function. The idea of turning this into something that's under individual control so that there is interactivity, so that you have a dialogue and a conversation, but that dialogue and conversation might be arm wrestling, or might be hurling yourself into the great void, or some other sets of phenomena which you physically interact with. And the idea now of writing programs where not just you see what you're doing and what you're interacting with, but it fights back at you, so that there are torquers acting upon you and acting upon your mass and your orientation. And sometime if you want to ride, come over. If you're willing to sign a little waiver, I'll be happy to put you in one of these things and see what you think about it. But it's kind of amusing. It's something that I think is going to be an interesting experiential sort of capability, and it extends the notion of what simulation is, and especially simulation in the entertainment industry, in a way that makes it a personal experience, and that's very satisfying, potentially.